The name Nintendo has a long history in the gaming landscape stretching back to the earliest days of the industry, a name that sparks nostalgia among many for their beloved characters, stories, and worlds. They've made some of the most well-regarded and innovative games of all time that have changed how people look at and design video games as a whole. Their contributions to gaming can't be understated, but for as much joy as their games have brought the gaming collective over the years, they also have an equally dark side. Many regard their business practices as anti-consumer, and if I had $1 for the amount of times that I heard Nintendo hates their fans, Nintendo is out of touch, or Nintendo is technologically behind, I'd be set for life. But how much of these statements are actually true? Well, today I intend on trying to answer that. If you've seen any of my other commentary-based videos, you know what you're in for, because this one will follow the same format. A brief history lesson of the company and what they've brought to the table, a summary of some of the big scandals and controversies involving them, and my personal takes on them as a whole. There'll probably be some dumb memes and jokes in there too. Is Nintendo the kind-hearted friend from your childhood that you remember, or have the years and success turned them into a money-hungry stranger that'll do anything to keep their precious IPs out of the grasp of others? And moreover, are they in the right to do that? Well, let's dig a little deeper and try and figure that out, and hopefully they don't send their team of assassin lawyers after me for this. Throw on the 7 Days to Die B-roll, this is the sad state of Nintendo. As someone who puts their games on such a pedestal like myself, it almost feels sacrilegious to criticize Nintendo. I've been a fanboy since the early days of my childhood, and still to this day I have an admiration for their games, and the sheer amount that they've contributed to the medium of video games. However, I can't deny that in recent years they've made some rather interesting choices regarding their products and those who enjoy them. But let's take a look back before it all went south, before their actions gave them a negative reputation in Goodsprings. Before I start tearing into them, I want to look at the things that they've created that made us love them to begin with, and subsequently, what made them the juggernaut in the industry that they are today. I think the biggest part of Nintendo's influence is how iconic and recognizable their characters and franchises are. Even those who don't like video games at least know of Nintendo's work. If I put a gun to their head, I'm sure most people could at least name Mario, Link, Kirby, and maybe even a handful of Pokemon. The sheer scope of IPs that Nintendo has developed or that owns the rights to is huge. They're like the Disney of video games in a sense, as they're one of the most mainstream companies that makes stuff that can appeal to pretty much anyone, regardless of age or how seasoned of a gamer they are. For that reason, they are well loved by many, both hardcore Nintendo fans and the more casual crowd who hardly knows what a video game is. The range of recognizable titles under their belt is insane if you include all the main series franchises and their spin-offs. Are you in the mood for something cozy? They've got Animal Crossing. You want a party game? We have Mario Kart, Mario Party, Mario smashes Peach, fucking Wario spills coffee on his dick and drives off a cliff. Okay, maybe not that last one. Many people, including myself, grew up with these beloved characters and thus have a certain nostalgic attachment to their games. I know whenever I see a new Zelda announcement or something, I get excited. They've created a multimedia empire with an absolutely insane amount of merch, movies, games, etc. It's part of the reason stuff like Smash Bros is so special, since we get to see each of these fan-favorite characters together in one place. I'd say they're one of, if not the best developers at building a recognizable brand. Another of the big reasons that they're so well regarded is for the sheer scope of ways that they've innovated the gaming industry over the years. I mean, Mario 64 pioneered 3D gaming by revolutionizing controllable cameras and movement in 3D space, and essentially created the 3D platformer genre that was huge in the early 2000s. Their influence on the platformer genre is actually so huge that they got a thank you and recognition from the developers of Astrobot when they won Game of the Year for a platformer in the year 2024, which is wild to me.
But I want to pay tribute to the company who really put platformers and showed us innovation and quality consistently and inspired us to actually make the game that we made. So that's also, and I've managed not to mention them, have you noticed? But you all know who they are.
Zelda Ocarina of Time laid the groundwork for narrative-driven 3D open-world adventure games and was one of the first to use context-sensitive button prompts and lock-on cameras. Pokemon was many people's first foray into turn-based RPGs and popularized the idea of capturing monsters to build teams in battle with. Many of these features are mainstays in many types of games nowadays, but you can trace a clear lineage back to these landmark titles that popularized the use of these staples. Many regard these games as being iconic and some of the best video games ever made, both for their contributions to the medium and for just how fun they were as games. Dan Houser of Grand Theft Auto fame was once quoted as saying, "Anyone who makes 3D games who said they've not borrowed something from Zelda or Mario for the 64 is lying." This extends not only to their games, but their hardware as well. For as hit or miss as their gimmicks have been over the years, they've consistently tried to do things differently and push the envelope for their hardware. For a recent example, look no further than the Nintendo Switch. The console handheld hybrid was really a neat idea, and other companies took note of this, and we got things like the Steam Deck and whatever that Asus thing that they were working on. They saw the Switch and said, hey, what if we did that, but it had more than 4 games and could run them better than my TI-89 calculator? This actually goes as far back as the Nintendo Wii, which basically kicked off the whole trend of making motion controls for better or worse. Technologically behind or not, they seem to at least try to innovate with each new console generation, which is respectable in my opinion, and oftentimes it seems to pay off as half the best-selling consoles of all time are Nintendo products. The final thing that I think cements them as one of the more beloved developers is the sheer commitment of quality they have for their games. Generally speaking, their first-party developed games are quite well made and show a clear love for the series, and in a time of rushed annual releases that are blatant soulless cash grabs, it's refreshing to see a developer seemingly care about their games. Going back to earlier as an example, with Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time being ranked as some of the best video games of all time and for good reason, but those aren't the only games in their catalog that are beloved by fans and critics alike. Many people to this day talk about their other landmark titles and how great they hold up even compared to games released in current year, and the list of those is extensive. If you take a look at any top 100 games of all times list, much of those lists will be populated with Nintendo games. The fact that they've been able to almost consistently maintain this level of quality over the years is nuts, and I don't see many other developers that can say that. Sure, we might have to wait a decade between mainline Metroid games, but as Gabe Newell once said,
"Hopefully, it will have been worth the wait."
It's probably for this reason that Nintendo games never depreciate in value, because people will still pay full price or more for a game 4 and 10 years later. Seriously, what the shit is this? Why in the year of our Lord 2024 is Pokemon for the original DS $120? But I'm getting ahead of myself, I have more on that in a bit. Even their worst games are still middle of the road good, a solid 6 or 7 out of 10, with the only downsides usually being that they don't have the hardware to back up what they're doing with the games. Hell, the 64 had trouble pushing 30 FPS in Ocarina of Time, and that was way back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, but it's still considered an absolute classic. It's for these reasons that I and many others love them as a developer, but here's the part where I talk about why I hate them as a company. But before I get into this rant, I should make sure to clarify some things. I'm not an expert on laws, I'm just some guy on the internet with opinions who read some articles, and I'm presenting my findings to you guys for informative and entertainment purposes. So take everything I say with a heaping tablespoon of salt, and if I make an error or forget some corner case example, please don't crucify me. With that out of the way, let's get into this. Far and away, the negative thing they're most infamously known for is their heavy-handed legal action. Whether it be a cease and desist letter or a full-blown DMCA takedown or lawsuit, Nintendo has strict enforcement when it comes to their IPs, to the degree that it seems like anything that isn't specifically blessed and sanctioned by the God Emperor Nintendo is subject to takedown, and no matter how small or large you are, they will go out of their way to hunt you down. Are you making a mod or fan game to show your appreciation for a series and not for profit? Not on my watch. Are you a content creator streaming or making videos using their games? No, f*** you, we hate free marketing. They're so comically evil that they once even shut down a charity event in memorial to a popular YouTuber who tragically passed. It's like they'll stop at nothing to prevent their fans from showing their appreciation for their games. That's all without even getting into the gray area that is emulation, limited run games, and preservation of game history, but I've got a whole section on that later. The kicker is that they keep getting away with it, which just seems to cement their mindset that they can keep doing it. The sheer list of things that they've done just in the last few years is nauseatingly long, and their legal warpath sets a dangerous precedent for the gaming industry as a whole. If they can keep doing this, what's to stop every big corporation from following suit? The name Nintendo that was once associated with your favorite childhood classic games has become synonymous with this giant corporate boogeyman who uses their massive influence and endlessly deep pockets to bully anyone and everyone who even thinks about using their products not as Nintendo intended, or recently if it even shares similarities with a Nintendo product. So in this upcoming section, I'm going to run through a very abridged timeline along with some brief summaries of some of the most ridiculous legal actions that Nintendo has done over the years. Note I won't cover every single thing, but I will briefly touch on most of the big ones. Alright, cue up the montage music and let's get into this. In 2013, Nintendo tries to copyright claim all ad revenue from YouTube videos using their products. Don't worry though, a couple years later in 2015, they'll establish the Nintendo Creators Program, which allowed you to make content on specific Nintendo-approved games, as long as they get it cut of course. In 2016, Nintendo issued DMCA takedown notices to two popular fan games, another Metroid 2 remake and Pokemon Uranium, which took 6 and 9 years respectively to make, and were basically built from the ground up as entirely new games as love letters to their franchises. They were initially nominated for the Best Fan Creation at the Game Awards that year, but due to Nintendo, the nominations were subsequently revoked. Taking down fan projects isn't a new thing, as over 500 indie projects on GameJolt were taken down just in that year alone. In 2017, a policy update to the Nintendo Creators Program restricted creators from live streaming Nintendo content just to make the whole system more convoluted, and a year later they just gave up entirely on the program and shut it down, with their current video policies loosely defined on their website, which, just in my opinion, gives them the leeway to take down anything that they don't like. I'm genuinely surprised they haven't yet doxed Scott the Woz and publicly crucified him for constantly talking about and showing Nintendo games. In 2019, Nintendo issues a DMCA takedown of Mario Royale, a popular remake of Mario 1 but as a battle royale with 75 players. Nintendo sees the popularity of this and takes it down, only to make an inferior version a year later with only 35 people, which of course was only available for a limited time. Mario Royale was later re-released without Nintendo assets under the clever moniker of DMCA Royale, and two versions remain to stay under different teams. Also in 2019, Nintendo issued several copyright claims on YouTube channels posting soundtracks to their games, which, while they're in their legal right to do so, they've also never attempted to offer an alternative via Spotify or other music streaming app. It's a shame because you know your boy loves the Ocarina of Time soundtrack and would play that on loop for every car ride. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, 2020 was one of the worst years for Nintendo. During this time, when many events transitioned online due to the state of the world, the annual Smash Melee tournament The Big House was shut down by Nintendo due to the tournament using an emulator which allows for net play and a ripped copy of the game, as they believed it supported piracy, subsequently causing many members of the Smash community to add the #FreeMelee onto their names, which was actually what got the NA stream of a Splatoon 2 tournament shut down later that year. And after Sony jointly acquired the fighting game tournament EVO, Nintendo would end up pulling Smash Bros from that in 2022, assumedly out of spite. Finally, maybe the most scummy and controversial event of 2020 was after the YouTuber Etika tragically took his own life. A fan launched a campaign making custom Etika-themed Joy-Cons to raise money for a mental health charity. Nintendo caught wind of this, stepped in, and demanded it be shut down due to using too many of Nintendo's logos in the design. In 2021, Nintendo sued a then 51-year-old man by the name of Gary Bowser for piracy charges, and after all was said and done in court, they let him off with a small fine of $14.5 million. After serving 14 months of a 40-month jail sentence, he's now stuck paying 20 to 30% of his income to Nintendo for the rest of his life. The story behind that is wild. The man actually got armed forces breaking into his house when they arrested him, and while most people would receive a fine and that's it, they wanted to make a statement of this man. In 2022, they announced that they'd be shutting down the eShop and other online functionality for the Wii U and 3DS family of products, effectively making a whole library of games unavailable for the foreseeable future. Currently, only some legacy titles are available on the Switch Online, and only if you get the deluxe version of the service. Ending the statement off with,
"We currently have no plans to offer classic content in other ways and also don't pirate our games."
Finally, we get to current year. In 2024, Nintendo issued takedown notices of almost 20 years of mods to the game Garry's Mod featuring Nintendo content. If you grew up on the internet in the early 2000s, this particular bit hurts, as Garry's Mod content was huge back in the day, and even if the popularity has passed, it was a neat part of gaming and internet culture that's now gone. Also this year, they took down many of the big-name Switch emulators and ROM hosting sites, and even sent copyright strikes to YouTubers for showing emulation footage on their channels. At the time of me writing this, the final noteworthy event is the ongoing lawsuit against Palworld. Many thought this game was going to get a copyright lawsuit for the designs of the pals, but as it turns out, they're going after Pocket Pair for patent infringement. Nintendo claiming that the patents in question are the ball capture system, the combat state triggered by throwing a creature at another, and the most ridiculous of them all, the mount system. And while technically, to my knowledge, the lawsuit is legal, it's also incredibly underhanded. It feels to me at least that Nintendo is trying to monopolize broad gameplay concepts, simply due to seeing that Palworld has become a popular and fresh experience where Pokemon has grown kind of stagnant over the years. Like, how are you going to try and copyright mounts? That shit's been in every game for the last 20 years. Where does the madness end, Nintendo? This iron grip they have on their properties and broad gameplay concepts just shows how out of touch and borderline delusional Nintendo is. Hell, as much as I love making fun of Bethesda, even they have dedicated modding tools available for their community. It's been shown time and time again that mods are what give your game longevity. Hell, it's the reason that people are still playing Skyrim after a decade, and if given formal support, it puts you in a good light amongst most of your fans. It should be a given that you shouldn't be trying to fight the people who are enjoying your products and creating things that improves your games. And while protecting your IPs is important, in order to prevent blatant ripoffs, you can't claim to own everything even remotely similar. That prevents competition and stifles creativity. You're trying to build a monopoly around video game concepts, and if allowed to continue, that just means that less people can make cool games using those gameplay features in the future, which just is a net negative for the industry as a whole. Imagine if FromSoft put a patent on dying, or Minecraft on building things using blocks. Apart from the legal warpath they've been on over the last decade, they've gotten wrapped up in a handful of other miscellaneous problems which I'm going to briefly skim over now. The oftentimes faulty Joy-Con drift issue still hasn't been properly addressed and was issued a class action lawsuit that, to my knowledge, Nintendo got the cases thrown out through some legal witchcraft. The Switch frame rate chugs badly on both first and third-party developed games, making the Switch version an inferior way to play games in most cases. And finally, the Nintendo Switch Online service just doesn't work. It's a straight-up scam. The online multiplayer functionality is reminiscent of playing via dial-up internet as it connects console to console, for why I can only assume that Nintendo doesn't want to pay for servers. I personally think that paying for online console services is dumb in itself, but they didn't even try with this one. They're just literally asking you to pay twice for your own internet and some lazily emulated legacy titles. For $20 a year, you get the shitty online connection and access to NES, SNES, and Game Boy games. And on top of that, they charge an entire extra $30 for access to N64, Game Boy Advance, and Sega games. Remember that emulating legacy titles is bad unless Nintendo does it. Obviously, yes, it's cheaper than most online services, but those generally give you access to new and old games alike, along with dedicated multiplayer servers, so you're actually getting something for your hard-earned money in those cases. Speaking of legacy content, a practice that they've thankfully seemingly moved away from, but one that I still believe is worth mentioning, is limited time digital releases. Back in 2020, Nintendo released Fire Emblem 1 and Mario 3D All-Stars as limited-time digital releases only available for that year. It may be a nitpicking complaint, but I feel like the relatively small window of time to purchase these games, that, mind you, don't have any additional content, just feels scummy. It feels like they're creating an artificial shortage of a product for no good reason. It's not like digital releases are costing you materials to make them or anything, so why would it be a timed thing? To add insult to injury, 3D All-Stars felt like an extremely lazy cash grab. Initially released as a full $60 game for the Switch, 3D All-Stars included emulated versions of Mario 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy 1. Sunshine initially didn't even have native support for the controller it was designed to use. On top of what I said earlier about not adding additional content, the notable absence of Galaxy 2 and the overall lazy presentation just made this collection lackluster. For comparison's sake, Crash and Spyro got trilogy remakes from the ground up 2 and 3 years prior, which is insane to me that they remade these games in such good quality and that Nintendo couldn't even be bothered to put any work into their collection. In order to get this game now, you'll have to find a physical copy, which you can order online for the crisp price of $130 to $150. That price listing goes for almost all older physical copies of Nintendo games. Most of these games are completely unavailable for purchase outside of private sellers online for extremely inflated prices. I think this is one of the biggest issues and why everyone turns to emulation to enjoy these games. Just look at any Pokemon for the DS, for example. The only option outside of emulation is to buy it online, assuming you have a DS laying around to play it, and buying it online usually means purchasing it from an individual, in which case Nintendo won't even pocket any money for it, so they're not benefiting from this, and the consumer sure isn't. It's just arbitrarily scarce for no reason, and for those who want to play these games, it's just unrealistic that they'll ever be able to do so without either selling a kidney to do so, or turning to the dark side of... Here's where we get to the big spooky topic as of late, and really what most of my previous complaining was leading up to. Nintendo has been at the game of combating emulation in the name of stopping piracy for decades now, but in recent years they've really started to crack down on it. As I briefly touched on earlier, this year alone they've taken down several Switch emulators and ROM hosting sites, and even struck down videos for simply showing emulation taking place, and they don't show any signs of stopping. Their tendency for aggressive legal action and clear stance on emulation has put them at the forefront of corporate nonsense when it comes to the discussion of emulation, piracy, and video game preservation. And the actual laws regarding emulators and copyright in general are tricky. Emulators themselves aren't illegal, but bypassing copyright measures is, as is the downloading and distribution of ROMs for them. But what about when a game isn't available otherwise? Going back to what I was saying earlier about how there's entire libraries of games that have been more or less lost to time outside of emulation since the console debuted on and phased out. Oftentimes, these games aren't ported to future consoles, or readily sold or available anywhere. Or in some cases, the developer simply doesn't want to make those games available for one reason or another.
It's my IP to sit on and do nothing with.
It's still illegal, but in my opinion, it's not morally wrong, especially if it's the only realistic way you're able to play some titles. Which is a shame because Nintendo of all people has some of the greatest legacy games of any developer, and emulation is capable of bringing these beloved titles to people who wouldn't otherwise get a chance to play them. That's not even mentioning ROM hacks, randomizers, and quality of life mods, which all add so much replayability to these older games. Emulation also offers online play and eliminates many of the annoying hurdles of playing older games, like finding the right cords and hardware to play them, and hoping that your old disc and cartridges still even work. As much as I love physical copies of games and consoles from a collector's standpoint, it's just kind of a pain, and sometimes the pricing is unrealistic for most of it, and most of these things degrade over time, eventually making them even harder to come by. If you put a stop to emulation, you basically lose all of this work and ingenuity that the community's done over the years, all out of passion for your games, and that feels to me like a spit in the face to your community. It seems like Nintendo's stance on emulation is of the mindset that emulating their games is piracy through and through despite the reason as to why, as it makes people less likely to purchase them, and therefore they're losing profit. Profit that they wouldn't even get since the game isn't available for purchase anymore. This backwards out-of-touch logic just makes me think of a couple quotes by developers in the industry that make a lot more sense than whatever the fumes Nintendo is huffing. The first is from Gabe Newell, which goes as follows. We think there's a fundamental misconception about piracy. Piracy is almost always a service problem and not a pricing problem. The easiest way to stop piracy is not by putting anti-piracy technologies to work, it's by giving the people a service that's better than what they're receiving from the pirates. It's probably the reason why pretty much everyone on PC uses Steam. It's convenient, accessible, and you get some pretty decent deals on games. Not to mention that it has the workshop for user-created mods for your favorite games, and all manner of titles from AAA to indie. It's overall just a really wonderful platform with so many good features that puts the consumer first. Gabe really cooked with this one. And the second was a series of tweets more recently from Running with Scissors, the developers of Postal, which basically boiled down to them saying they don't mind people pirating their games as it allows them to reach more people, and if they like it, they can always support them when they're financially able to do so. Following it up with, indie developers like us will only be able to do new and cool stuff with financial support, so you can pirate but consider supporting, which I just think is an incredibly base take to have. All in all, this corporate game of whack-a-mole where Nintendo will sue the pants off a ROM site, emulator developer, or fan project just to have another one pop up immediately after is just a blatant waste of resources. You're never going to stop it. Clever people will always find a way to bypass it, and those who simply don't want to pay for a product probably weren't going to buy it to begin with. So you're just stuck doing this same dance forever, like the Ouroboros eating its own ass or whatever the Egyptians said. However, they'll continue to do so and probably get away with it because they have all of the money in the universe, and regular people or small studios don't have the resources to fight it out in court until the heat death of the universe, regardless if they have a solid case or not. But with all of that money you're wasting hunting these people down with copyright strikes and court cases, you could be putting that towards servers that don't suck and developing new ways for people to enjoy your older, less obtainable titles. Take all the remasters and remakes from other studios we've been getting in recent years. It's made these fan-favorite games available to whole new generations of players, and all of those are from studios way smaller and with less resources than Nintendo. It all just feels to me like somewhere along the line Nintendo stopped caring about their fans or giving them a fun experience or even making good games. It all became about the money and the control over their properties. They know what you want better than you do, and thusly you will enjoy their products only as they want you to, or you won't get them at all. Which is sad. You shouldn't be fighting your fans or stifling creativity or making accessing your video games a fucking hostage situation. I'm not mad Nintendo, I'm just disappointed. All of this ranting is just in hopes that they'll eventually take note and do better, maybe get their priorities in line, because as much as I love them as a developer, I hate them as a company. Thank you for watching, roll the outro. Hey y'all, it's been a while since I've done one of these commentary-based video essays. They generally seem to do the best in my videos, so I hope you guys enjoyed it and it was worth the wait. Sorry it took so long, I caught a cold, so if I sound funny, that's why. Thusly, I've been doing nothing but hard grinding ranked League of Legends, and while I'm over the cold, I don't think I'll ever recover from the League-induced brain tumor. Anyway, I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you agree with my take? What are your thoughts about game preservation and emulation? I believe it's an important topic to think about as gaming progresses forward and more titles are becoming harder to access. As always, if you like this video, leaving a like and subscribing helps out a ton and I'd appreciate it a lot. You can find my other content organized by playlist as well as my socials in the description if you want to check out any of that. And I'll probably make these commentary-based videos into a playlist too, so if you're here mostly for those, they'll be neatly organized by the time this video goes live. If you really like my content, you want to support me, there's a Patreon link in the description where you can get your name on screen now. But no pressure, I'm just glad you're here watching this, that's really what means the most to me. Speaking of Patreon, a huge thank you to NDH and Liz for your guys' top tier Patreon support. It really means the world to me, and it helps me continue to make these silly videos, and I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you all once again for watching, I hope you have a good one, and I will see you next time.